Hi, everyone. This is Lisa and Elise, and we're here to do a recap from our Vision Day last Saturday in the lab as we're looking at what it will look like to tangibly create a space that will help us on our quest as a community of becoming. And so we met together, the team that has volunteered to help develop this vision and start to think about our physical space in the lab, but also our spaces online or wherever we might gather. How can we start to think about how we use those spaces and how we design those spaces to help us become who we want to be? So Elise is a part of that team, but she is also an expert. So we asked her to come and do a workshop with us to start us on the process of starting to think about how to think about this process. Elise is an assistant professor at Baylor University. She's an architect, she's an ethicist, a theologian, a member of Convergence, a writer, a friend, and infinitely qualified to lead us through this process. So thank you so much for Saturday. We had a blast and we learned so much. So we're going to attempt in this Zoom call to sort of catch up those of you who weren't able to be with us and have a recording, a record for all of us that we can go back to. So Elise is going to share some of what she shared on Saturday, and then we're going to share some of our notes and our takeaways from that day, and hopefully be able to have some conclusions. So Elise, hello.
Great. Well, hi. It was an honor to be able to do this at Convergence. It was really nice to meet with you all in person after seeing so many of you on screen for many years now. Of course, we've met in person before. I'd met almost everybody, although there were a few people there I hadn't gotten to know. So it was nice to be able to do this workshop together. When we first got together, I talked about the purpose of our meeting, which was to really set a vision for the lab building. We talked about how we may not call it just the lab anymore. It may be something like the culture lab or Convergence culture lab. But for the purpose of continuity and clarity, we referred to it as the lab during this discussion. But that remains open, what it's called, what it becomes known by. And I'd encourage us to think through that so that it's a way that really reflects what the purposes are. So that being said, we started off talking about the vision for the building. We talked about what functions it needs to accommodate and what it feels like. The question we had hoped to get to, but we didn't, was what are the aesthetics? And that, I think, is a question that can be worked out in future discussions. And I'm happy to work with us all to get there. But I also think we can hire a professional architect who will help us really refine that. I think for the idea of getting a vision of what the building could be, we did some great work on Saturday, and I'm really excited about what comes next. So let me say a little bit about what I started off the presentation with. We did start off with naming those purposes for the meeting and the questions we were going to cover. But then I introduced myself. We had some introductions that we all knew who was there. And I introduced myself primarily in relation to my work. So as Lisa, you mentioned just a couple minutes ago, I'm an architect and an ethicist. And I'm working on a book right now about the design process from a theological standpoint. So the key question of that book is, how do we create buildings in a way that really reflects the commitments that we have from God? And specifically in my book, it's commitments towards justice. So in that, I have 5 key moral commitments in design that I talk about. And I introduced this to our team on Saturday. And I don't know if you have a slide about this, Lisa, but the 5 moral commitments are creativity, empathy, discernment, beauty, and sustainability. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of those. So the first is creativity. which I talked about in terms of visionary imagination. Lisa and I are both fans of this book by Deborah Haynes called The Vocation of the Artist. And in it, she talks about how artists are called to be people who help us conceive of alternative futures that aren't dystopian, right? That aren't the end of the world, but are these what we would in Christian terms call these these redemptive narratives, these arcs that lead us towards hope rather than to despair. And part of that is the artist's exercise of visionary imagination, which means that we imagine what could be. And we do that to lean into a vision of the future of what's possible. And that's really the heart of what we start design with. And what we were focused on Saturday is this visioning process. So no one's going to argue that that architects or that design shouldn't be creative. So creativity is sort of an obvious first moral commitment there. But what makes it a moral commitment instead of just a artistic commitment or a commitment to be creative in the process is this idea of vision, that we're leaning into something that we find redemptive and something that that we think God is leading us toward. So the second moral commitment then is empathy, which is the way that we exercise care for our neighbors. And with a building like the lab, we have multiple neighbors that we think about. There's the physical neighbors, right? There's the people at Christ the King, the congregation there that is now in the building that used to be part of our property. There's the neighbors on the street. There's the local businesses and the people driving by on the street, the passersby. They're part of our neighbors too. We also have to think of the people who are part of our community in terms of the people who are part of the Convergence community who are joining us online. I'm typically one of those people, and today I'm one of those people, but we have to remember that they're part of our community too and are joining us, and that when we're thinking of empathy, we're trying to imagine, particularly from a Christian standpoint, what does this project mean for the least of these? In other words, we're always pushing ourselves to say, who are we not thinking about? Who are we forgetting is a key part of this? And when we're thinking of in-person spaces, actual facilities, we might forget about the people in our community who aren't always joining us in those facilities. So we want to look for ways throughout the design process that we can involve the people who join Convergence online. They may never actually get to physically be in that space, or they may decide at times, if there's a special event that they come, or that they are that they want to contribute something to the space, or that they see the space in the background of other meetings that they're participating in. So we want to just be aware of what we're providing to a variety of neighbors, especially those who have the most needs that are unmet. And to see how we might meet that. That was really a vision that Convergence had early on in its beginning. I don't think I mentioned this on Saturday, but back when Lisa and I were thinking about this years ago, when we were redesigning the gallery and the lab space, the old building, we were thinking about what does Convergence need to be who it wants to be? And that's partly why we created a gallery, and also why we decided there needed to be studio space in the lab building, that it was a way that we could meet the needs of our Alexandria neighbors. So that kind of questioning is always relevant and is going to be important. So that's creativity, the first moral commitment; empathy, caring for our neighbors, the second moral commitment. The third is discernment. And this is a process of making wise decisions. In any design process, we have to make decisions, and we want to make decisions that reach some level of consensus, meaning that we have agreement on them, and that it's widespread commitment that everyone in the community is a part of. In the purposes of design, we're not really, when I say consensus, we're not really thinking of it in like a Quaker sense where everybody absolutely feels on one accord. But we mean something more like everyone has had a chance in the process to state their views. Everyone has had a chance to participate. Everyone has made the best effort to understand others in the process, which goes back to empathy. And that because of that, even when decisions are made that we don't personally agree with, or they may not be what our choice was, we can commit to stand behind them because we understand the process that it was decided by, and we think that the process was fair and that everyone had a voice in that. So we agree not to be part of the problem going forward, that we're not constantly revisiting decisions that were already made, because you just can't move forward in design with a process like that. Before I go on, Lisa, did you have any questions or comments on this first 2 or 3 moral commitments?
I would only say there was something that you just sort of spat, just kind of came out of your mouth on Saturday when you were thinking about the space and online, little ideas like using images as our background.
Yeah.
For on like ways that we can make that more present, and it feels very gift oriented, which was very creative that we had not thought about or talked about before. So I just, there's a lot of ideas that started coming out of even your commitments.
Yeah, I mean, as we talk about, hybrid types of activities, you and I had discussed how we'll have to wrestle with whether activities are primarily in person with an online component, or whether they're online with an in-person component. And those that are in person with an online component, we want to make sure that we're thinking about our backdrops, right? This has become a Zoom pastime, right? Looking at people's shelves and stuff behind them, right? But we want to have a backdrop that mimics the same feel of the space, which an obvious way of doing that is just having a backdrop of the space, whether that's a real background that we're setting up, with our cameras, or whether it's a virtual background from the spaces that we typically join together. I also mentioned, and I may have said this a minute ago too, that we may want to have that people who join us primarily online, but are part of the community here, may want to send things that become part of the space. Since we have so many artists who are part of this work, we may have people who commit, who send us artworks, who send us poems or writings that are about this, that then become words that might get displayed somewhere or incorporated into a mural or something like that. So there are many ways that even those who are participating online could eventually see themselves in that space, even though they're not there physically.
I love that. That's great.
And I want to say about discernment that we have, that as Christians, we want to honor the movement of the Holy Spirit. That when we make decisions as Christians, we always want to be listening for the movement of God and for how God speaks to us. And so as we make decisions, we want to do so with prayer, with theological reflection, which is why I'm talking about some of these moral commitments. This is a little bit of the theological reflection. But I'll be sending Lisa a chapter of the book that these 5 ideas come from, which is called Building Justice, by the way, Theological Commitments in Architectural Design. I will send her the draft of this chapter, which shouldn't be disseminated, obviously, because it's not yet published, but I'm happy for you all to work through it and to help you work through the questions that this chapter raises. It goes through a process of noticing and describing what we have, and then moving to making decisions about what's next through social analysis and theological analysis. And I'll say much more about that in depth later on. But discernment is the process of making wise decisions guided by the Holy Spirit. The 4th moral commitment is beauty. And this is saying that we want to design spaces that have aesthetic appeal. I'm not committed to any one definition of what aesthetic excellence is. I think that we can have a very minimalist versions of beauty or very elaborate, highly decorated, ornamented versions of beauty. I think the key idea is that the aesthetics of a space resonate with its underlying ethos or underlying spirit or sense of place. So I mentioned that I find it very frustrating when I go to churches that say they're so progressive and novel thinking and open-minded, and they have lace doilies all over the sanctuary, that the preacher's glass of water is sitting on, and it's all very traditional in the architecture of the space. And I don't have anything against traditional architecture or even lace doilies, but they are a very literal representation of tradition and of things that are carried on from the past, which is perfectly adequate and appropriate for a church to have as its ethos. But if you're saying how progressive and forward thinking you are, you need to have a space that you gather in, and the things that you do worship with that are also reflecting that same sentiment. So in one way, it's kind of very literal, right? If you want things to be, if you want to emphasize how open-minded you are, you can't have a space that feels closed in. If you want to be invitational, you have to have things that an entryway that literally invites people in, and think about that all the way at the street level. How are you bringing people in and helping them find where they need to go? And if you're forward thinking, then you need to have artwork and messaging around the place that says you're forward thinking. If you're traditional, you want to have things that reinforce that traditional view and say what traditions you're clinging to. So beauty has to have that aesthetic appeal is necessary because it's part of our delight for our souls. It's part of what of the true vision of shalom and harmony and peace that God intends for us to experience as humans together. And yet we want it to be consistent with the message.
Yeah, I love that. So you said spaces we feel delighted by. I think that's great. That's a visceral way to think about beauty in terms.
Yeah, and this is influenced here. I'm influenced by the work of Nicholas Wolterstorff, who talks about this in his book Art in Action, where shalom is part of. He's writing this decades ago and saying art isn't just for aesthetic contemplation. It's for this sense of shalom that we experience, this delight and this sense of something more. I talk about it elsewhere as when I'm talking about beauty in this book as gratuity, as something extra, right? Like a bonus, a gift that God gives us, part of an expression of God's grace. That's not just about utility or function, but is really about delight.
Yeah, that's a great word.
And then the last moral commitment is sustainability. We want to make sure that we're designing and building in a way that is taking care of the creation, of God's creation, and that we're being good stewards of that. Sustainability, very literally, is making sure that we have that we're passing on a better future to those who follow us than what we might see as happening if we don't do anything, which brings us back to that visionary imagination, right? The artist's role is to anticipate or to invoke this alternative future. And sustainability is a key part of that. We want to make sure that we're designing with materials that keep people safe and healthy, that we're limiting what goes into landfills, that we're reducing our consumption, and what we're purchasing, we're reusing when possible, or recycling when we can. And that when we are purchasing things and when we're building new, that we're using the best materials that are sourced ethically, and that we are minimizing waste, and that we're handling potentially toxic waste in a safe way. which is an issue with the lab considering the year that it was built. There is asbestos in the building. I'm not sure where, probably in the floors, possibly other places as well, just given the age of the building. There may be other sorts of harmful materials that are fine when they're untouched and left alone. But when we start working with changing the building, that might be an issue. So we always want to think about the health and safety of the occupants, present and future, and not simply pass problems down to the future, that, oh, this has been a problem, but we're not going to deal with it. We'll let the future people take care of it. As much as possible, beginning to address some of those challenges now.
Well, so that is a really good foundation that we started with. That's really, really helpful. So then where did you lead us, Elise, into this conversation as we start to talk about, about what oh, there you are talking.
Well, after we went through this, we started to talk a little bit about what a space of becoming might mean. So when we were thinking through these three questions that I said: what functions we need to accommodate, what do we want it to feel like, and what is the aesthetic framework? But we began with the bigger question of what does it mean to be a space of becoming? So what might this space actually, what does that represent, a space of becoming? That had been in some of the language that we'd looked at in the documents that we had. And I don't know if you're planning to attach those, Lisa, to the video here, or the recording. But many of those did talk about a space of becoming, or one of them did talk about a space of becoming. So we had some discussion about what that meant. And some of the ideas that came up, I can share those. You can chime in too with your notes. But we were talking about a space of becoming. Karen started us off thinking about things that were not yet finished, in a way, that they're movable, that you have elements of the space that are literally becoming, right? So yeah, that first point, they're movable, transformable. That this isn't really a space of rest, which is kind of static, but it's a space of transformation and shifting, of recreation. So a sense of it being unfinished, that there might be some elements of discovery in this space, that there might be things that become something else. So we talked literally about movable panels, movable wall panels that can help change the room around, or that become display space for art. We talked about creating different spaces for creative action. So there might be, there seemed to be a sense that there is in the lab this large space, and that we keep that to some degree as a multi-function space that is for multiple uses, but that we need different kinds of spaces. We're not all just going to have one space, right? So we're not blowing out all the walls to just create one giant room, that we might need spaces for silence and for rest, even though, a space of becoming isn't necessarily that, but you might have this space of becoming and then this other contemplative space that's more quiet, or we talked about maybe that being like a chapel or something, a space of silence. We talked about having a transformable area that could be a chapel, and it could be outdoor space as well, that is visible to the passersby coming to this area. Space of becoming, we also talked about a space where we actually do work together, right? And do the work of becoming who we should be together. So in just a moment, we'll talk about the functions the space needs to accommodate. But that means that we have spaces, this is an obvious point, for people to meet, right? But it's going to be a space where people can meet and come back to. We talked about this image of spiritual gym, which you might want to say a little more about.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, this idea of a space of becoming comes from other sources, but the idea is that if we are, as a community of faith, seeking to become who God created us to be, then there's a process of discovering what that is. So exploring the Bible, exploring God's activity in our life, but then also spurring each other on to growth, not just personal spiritual growth, but that leads to action. So how do we create a space that really helps us, that reflects our values and also maybe encourages us subconsciously to become who we are meant to be, both as an organization, as Convergence, and as individuals. And one of the things we talked about in that is thinking about what it even looks like to be church, creating, rather than meeting once a week for an hour, creating a spiritual gym where it's a space where you can work out. There's classes, there's groups, there's contemplative prayer, there's activity where you're doing things, there's time to work on different muscles that we need, as well as classes for soul makers, and worship kinds of activities, which we talked about expanding that into more like installation art experiences or worship experiences, maybe that go over long periods of time. So that there's space for things to be happening throughout the week, and that ultimately part of the success of the space would be that people were in the space on a regular basis, allowing it to work on us. That would be a part of what would be necessary, is that it would truly be a local space for people to be accessing.
Yeah, and that even the things that are on the walls inspire us, right? So earlier I was talking about like artwork from the artists we have here. We want to, display the work of mature artists as well as growing artists, right? So that we have, again, we'll talk about the functions or activities in a minute, but some long-term exhibit or display space, right? To show that of what we're aiming to become, or showing people who are already there and the work they're still doing and producing, right?
Yeah.
As well as those who are moving to get there. We want it to be aspirational, which I think means that we're looking at a space that has stuff on the walls, right? That has color and whether it's permanent or temporary, right? That you have things that are changing. And we talked about this also, that as you mentioned, we may have like a theme for a season of the year. Many churches follow a liturgical calendar where they will change out the colors of the church for Lent, or now we're in ordinary time, or for Easter, Pentecost, or Advent, Christmas. But at Convergence, we might do that, but we might also have a theme like working with something like fermentation, which was an idea a couple years ago, or something like culture care, right? And then using that to inspire the design of these key spaces, the exhibits, the gathering spaces, all have the feel of this. And that's what it means to be a space of becoming, that the space literally becomes something resonant with the ideas that are floating around at the time.
Yeah, some of the themes that kept coming up from Saturday that were surprising and interesting to me were the idea that if we are a space of becoming, then that necessarily means that it can't be too polished or too perfect. It can't be too corporate or even complete. The sense that maybe there is more texture in the physical space, or a sense of it not yet being complete. The idea that we want to create a space where when you walk in, you feel like Convergence is comfortable with deconstruction or with falling apart. But also that there's encouragement and space to build up again, or to grow. Like there was definitely this sense of roughness, but I think even Lynn used like neutral colors, but
Yes.
more texture. So
Yeah.
it feels safe to be unfinished. But then there
Yeah.
were also these themes, I think Ryan started it and Ken, of roundness.
Yep. Yeah.
And that really kind of became a feeling of comfort and safety. So this mix
Yeah.
between roughness and roundness, like the challenge and not needing to be perfect, but also the spaces that can kind of shape you
Yeah.
into safety or comfort, and then pushing out again. Like this
Yeah.
idea of like pushing in to the space and then pushing out again. That they suggest that this is a space in which something really happens and you're
Yeah.
expected to do something, not just come and sit and feel okay and
Yeah.
leave.
And Ken had this image of this revolving door, right?
Yeah.
Or little fun door, or fun little door, as he called it, right? At this office that he goes to, right? And I think that image of the revolving door captures what you were just saying about welcoming in, but then also pushing back out.
Right.
Into the world, this roundness, this cocooning or this labyrinth or spiral, this maze idea also came up, right? And what Ryan were saying, that there's this discovery again of spaces and these neat little moments that might happen in that. So it doesn't mean that literally we're going to have a maze in the lab building, right? But
Revolving door.
right, with revolving doors, right? It doesn't mean that, but it gives us an image to work with, to start with. And that could end up being something like, perhaps we have a labyrinth outside, or perhaps we have, with this sort of curved imagery, we have some sort of curved wall that becomes seating, or display space, or a way to block off a section of the room. Right. So you have these ideas that are out there that, as the design process continues, could become something more. Just a few other things. Prismatic light was another image that was evoked. This was one that Karen mentioned. The idea of light coming through and then being refracted in this prism. The idea of God being this light, and so this sense of this prismatic light of God always being part of it, and being in this movement, in this becoming, that God is motivating it and always participating in it. Going back to the curved thing, that we're looking at things that aren't boxy, spaces that don't feel like we're, hemmed in. Again, this is another cliche, right? But if we want to say we're not, we're out of the box people, then we wouldn't want to create a bunch of boxes for us to do Converge or Convergence with it. That's just not who we want to be, right? And we want to have things that interrupt just this sense of like moving from one box to another. So we may have like exposed ceilings. I do want to say some of this language might be, driving some people insane, thinking, oh my gosh, so we're going to be living in the middle of a construction project. We did talk about how this unfinished look doesn't have to be messy. If we think of like loft spaces that are designed with exposed ceilings and walls, but are often very neat and clean, those lean into that ethic or that aesthetic of becoming as well. So there are examples of this that don't have to seem messy or unfinished, but unfinished in a sense of construction projects that need to be done, right? A DIY list, but unfinished in a sense of it's not already completely put together in a way that there isn't room for the person who comes in to make it what it is, right? That even if we had gallery space, there's space for them to be on that wall at one point, right? Or space for them to sit, space for them to be part of this that's not already done and sleek and packaged and polished, but much more invitational.
Yeah. Good.
So last thing on that, we talked about having some flow and interaction between the spaces, or that flow and interaction being a key part of becoming as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, I don't know whether this idea, I think one of the things that I don't know whether this is the place to share it or somewhere else, but I think one of the key ideas that came out of the day was really the idea of invitation.
Yeah.
Of being an invitational space, that really should be a high priority for us, whether it's using the lawn out front at the lab or creating it a more visible, more inviting entry space, to invite people into the building, like even before anything else. That
Absolutely.
would be a primary function that we should play around with. And
yeah, and
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, we have multiple entrances to the building. So there are the entrances on the side that lead to the hallway near the bathrooms. There's the entrance on the opposite side under the stairs, the entrance to the large room on the side. There's the entrance to the stairwell that leads up to the second floor that Christ the King was using as the entrance for their offices. And then there's the front door that faces not Quaker Lane, but what's that?
Crestwood.
Yeah. So there's that door that has like the address on it out there. So you could take any of those, and with a little bit of work or a lot of work, depending on the scope of the project, turn that into a real entry space that is welcoming, that's visible from the streets, that whether you're parking on Quaker Lane or on the side street, or in the little lot, that you know where to enter the building, and there's a clear path of entry. So you want that entry to be visible, but you also want it to say something, right, about who you are, so that when you walk through those doors, or even as you're approaching those doors, you know what you're getting into, in a way, right? That this isn't just any old church or any old meeting building or any old artist studio, but that there's something different that's bringing these multiple strands together in this space.
Well, so we talked about put together now. We talked about the 6 things to consider around function, but at the end of the day, maybe you can just sort of talk about the ones that we are primarily focused on, and then you can see this list of the functions that we started to talk about, what happens in the space, primarily classes and small groups and worship, but then also opportunities for various kinds of exhibit and performance and being together, that we envision. So we start to think about that stuff. But yeah, maybe just talk briefly about the 1 or 2 of those 6 that we're really focused on, and then we can just sort of talk a little bit about our conclusions from the day, and then when we send this out, then I'll send out the notes that we got from everyone, along with the materials and stuff like that. So hopefully people will be pretty caught up.
Good. Well, these levels of change that we're talking about, I mentioned there's this book by Stuart Brand called How Buildings Learn, where he talks about 5 S's. So the idea is that buildings are always changing and growing and adapting to who's using them and what's needed of them. So buildings are learning, right? Design isn't done when the building is finished, which anyone who's been at Convergence knows, right? It's constantly changing and becoming what it needs to be. So Stuart Brand says 5 S's, I say 6 S's, and I'll tell you which one's mine. But site, once that's determined, that doesn't change much for centuries, right? So residential space tends to stay residential in terms of site, even though the homes may change. Retail or commercial space tends to stay that. Sometimes it switches, but for the most part, once that's determined, that stays. So site is the first S. Structure, the structure of a building is really expensive and difficult to change. So once that's there, that tends to stay until the building's demolished. You may make small changes, you may beef up structure, you may remediate it, but we're not really looking at changing that right now because of the cost. It would just be, it's usually just, once you start changing a structure, you just change the whole building. You tear the whole thing down. Shell or skin is the third S, right? So that's what the exterior looks like. Here we might see small changes or changes that are not significant in the way the shell or the skin of the building functions. Meaning this is where you're talking about doors and windows and the brick exterior on the lab building, the roofing. We're probably not going to change those things dramatically, although the window frames, for instance, were painted at Convergence a few years back. That's an example of changing the skin of the building without much investment or without a huge investment. For this, we may think about changing out some of the windows and doors. The windows at the lab building are frosted, that you can't see through them, they're translucent. We may decide that clear windows would be a better choice and a chance to bring some energy efficiency into the space as well. So skin is the third S, which we may work with if we're talking about invitational spaces and entries and connection between indoors and outdoors. We may work with that. Where services is another level. So that's just the plumbing, the heating, the cooling. Pretty much only fix that as we need to, right? So there might be some changes there, but we're not going to envision changing out that whole system unless it's something we have to do. Where I think we'll really begin to see more change is in the fifth S, space plan, which is the one I added. This is the layout of the rooms. So we may change that, we might not. It might not be structurally possible, but there may be some changes that we adjust. And rooms that were, for instance, upstairs that were probably classrooms at one point or small group rooms are now offices. That's a change to the space plan, right? So things like that become work that we will be doing. We'll be changing how the uses of the spaces are and the sequencing and where those are located. I'm certain that when that building was built, they didn't imagine artist studios on the second floor. So that's a change to the space plan that's already taken place and likely to continue. And then the last element is the one that changes all the time. And this is stuff, as Stuart Brand calls it, right? This is the furniture, this is the equipment, this is the decor, the curtains, the everything that we bring into the space. That changes all the time. It can change every week. If you're talking about fresh flowers on a table, it can change every season. If you're talking about the colors in a space, it can change every few years when you're talking about furniture. It might change every decade or so if you're talking about like flooring material or surfaces. So the stuff is definitely going to change. And that's that level of change that gets done fairly quickly and with much less investment of resources than say something like purchasing a new site or changing out the structure, right? So it's all comparable, right? Furniture isn't cheap, but much cheaper than a concrete floor and beams
Right.
and steel.
Good. Well, you had us kind of explore how we want to feel in those spaces by doing a creative exercise. And we came up with some words, but we also were kind of creating our own pieces, which was also very illuminating as we started to look at how we wanted to feel and then what might that actually look like.
Yeah, this was a fun exercise. I mean, it was really for the people who were there, a sense that many already knew, but perhaps hadn't thought of related to design of spaces, that these ideas we have about invitation. So we looked at the list of the space of becoming, right? The words we'd use there. and taking one of those and then representing it with paper, right? Either two-dimensionally or three-dimensionally. And it's just a fun exercise to give people who aren't used to this kind of thinking a real sense of how you can create something with strips of paper or with pieces of folded paper that evoke something. So here we see this like curved formation, that Ryan was talking about, this sense of shelter, right? That then connects to another piece. I think, Lisa, this might have been part of yours, right?
Yeah.
So it's this sense of taking these ideas and then putting a real vision to it. So for this one, we then looked at these actual sort of mini collages or sculptures or figure ground drawings, whatever we want to think of them as of what would this be if it were a real space. And we looked at some of those functions. So we had talked about how you mentioned just a minute ago, we'll need meeting rooms, not meeting rooms, that sounds so corporate, right? But spaces for groups to meet. We'll need spaces for worship. We'll need exhibit space. Some of the things that you wouldn't expect necessarily that others mentioned, we talked about like a holy of holies, right? Something, some space or place or object that talks about the holiness present there. That we need workshop rooms, things with tables, that we might need like a dining room or a patio for dining. We want dry erase or boards or chalkboard walls or something we can actually physically create on the walls. Maybe it's a giant cork board that we pin stuff to, right? If we don't want the dust or the residue that never seems to go away from chalkboards, right? That we want things where we can project things on, right? So we want some walls where we can project images and video on. We talked about making entrances a real place. So perhaps thinking about creating a lobby or a foyer or an entrance hall off of or into one of the spaces that currently exists. And then we talked about accessibility. We want to make sure that all of our spaces are accessible, which would mean if we're talking about the second floor, putting in an elevator or finding ways to make the first floor suitable for any of the functions that we might have on the second floor. So this becomes not just for people with disabilities, but people who want to have keep an eye on children. We want to make sure that spaces are in proximity to each other. People who are temporarily mobily challenged, right? You may have someone who's on crutches 1 week due to some accident or surgery that they had, where they won't be there forever, but we want to make sure that even when their small group is meeting, that they could be a part of it. And then finally, we talked about some sort of performance space or venue, not one that's for booking for other groups to rent. I don't think that's part of the vision anymore, that we're not a venue for other people's work, but for our own events, for our own intimate performances or gatherings. We may even want something like an amphitheater and beer garden where that playground is right now. That there's so many options for what this space can be, but we want to make sure that we have the spaces that we need to gather in the ways that we imagine.
Yeah.
Which is performance, exhibit, these creative types of spaces that you wouldn't see at other churches or Christian organizations.
Yeah, exactly. I think my final thoughts, and from all the conversation, there were so many great ideas that came up on Saturday. There seemed to be a real enthusiasm for this space that's it's sort of living and breathing, and it's happening all the time. If we're exploring something, like you mentioned, fermentation, if we're exploring something spiritually, then it's happening in everything that we're doing and in all of our spaces. And then when we're inviting the community into it, it's to engage something that we are that we're exploring, or we are intentionally inviting them into a deeper conversation about an alternative vision of what it means to be in the world or how to be in the world. And we're exploring that. And then, that then brings up all those questions about how we use our outdoor space to radiate that out. But it was a great conversation to get on a page, or at least pages that are near each other, to kind of understand. And I feel like we had a really good sense as we were leaving of what we want that to be, and an expanded sense of that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of energy, I think, to summarize some of the key things I heard. There's a lot of energy about the outdoor space and making that useful and artistic and beautiful, and a place where people can gather. So that might be multiple outdoor spaces, that lawn that's visible to others, and then that playground area, transforming that into something more intimate, or where people might meet or have poetry readings or whatever, right? We were talking about thinking of that chapel at Virginia Theological Seminary down the street. That is that outdoor space. It was the chapel that was burnt or destroyed, and it becomes its own outdoor like ruin. We're not trying to create a fake ruin, but that feeling of outdoor space that is some sort of holy presence, yet also in nature, is something we could do. So there was a lot of energy about the outdoor space, a lot of energy about creating an entrance or multiple entrances, and perhaps with patios or with enclosures that expand or make those spaces actually nice to walk into. And then there's also the sense of having a multi-purpose space that becomes transformable, which again doesn't mean we're changing it every week necessarily, right? We did talk about honoring the cycles of activity and rest, and quite honestly burnout that people have, and not overburdening is that we have to change the space every week, right? It might stay the same for a year, right? It could, right? But we want to have that ability for us to know from the start, we're not creating a space that looks the same the day that, we finish the design. 10 years from now, we know it's not going to look like that. That's not our intention, to keep it that way. It's to let it become something else as the need arises.
And something we haven't mentioned that came up a lot was this idea of modular walls, basically in the lab, not floor to ceiling walls, but that can be used as gallery walls, or just partition of sorts. And also the possibility of using fabric to create temporary rooms and spaces, because we have the sort of the grid beams up there that we can hang things on. So a lot of things that are not necessarily exorbitantly expensive that could change the dynamic considerably.
And the idea that we add these in over time. So not everything needs to be done at the first pass, but that we have a plan of saying, okay, if our focus this year is on, culture care, right? And this is the year we're going to use the fabric to create that. But, in 2 years, we'll be looking at this theme, and that's when we're going to do these walls, these movable walls, right? That not everything has to be done right off the bat, which I think leads us to next steps. So I do recommend that that over the next year, we continue to refine the vision, but that we begin to think about hiring an architect or an architecture firm to work with us on this kind of pre-design stuff, which is basically figuring out what's the scope of what we're talking about, what's the budget of what we're talking about. These are discussions the church needs to have, of course, before we necessarily hire someone, so that we're all on the same page, that we agree, and that we have a sense, but then to have a professional come in and really help us refine the vision for sequencing and staging, and also someone who can help us figure out the practicalities of the age of the building in terms of the codes that apply and do not apply, and grandfather had that we're grandfathered into, but would not be if we do certain kinds of work to the building.
Right. Well, good. Well, so then one of the next things after we send this out and people have a chance to look at that, we'll also send this chapter on discernment that you've written. And then we'd like to schedule a time for a Zoom conversation sometime in the next probably 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, to follow up on that conversation and to start that ball rolling to decide if, you know, if we hire an architect and who that would be, and obviously the budgeting kinds of things. But I think this is a really great start to get on the right level. And I will say that, you know, I know that this is a theological conversation and an ethical conversation, but we're very intentional about everything that we do at Convergence, and we're trying really hard to build a strong foundation and make plans for the future so that we're in this phase of our life at Convergence, we're not asking so many questions as we are trying to give people structure to build these things into their lives, and especially artists, and to be able to contribute to the larger community in that way. So it's important for us to be starting off on the right foot so that even our structures are helping us, are acting as a framework to keep us within our mission, to keep us within what God's calling us to do. And hopefully it's speaking, just the way the Benedictine monks talk about their cathedrals, their spaces, that just the building itself is shaping. And I really do believe that. I mean, you contributed so much when you designed the gallery space and designed the lab spaces in the very beginning. When the people were not there, it opened that space for people to come in and know, this is what can happen. This is who I can be in this space. So I believe in this process wholeheartedly, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us.
I do too. I mean, I really want to convey that this isn't a process to be scared of, and we're not trying to spend money just for the sake of spending money or make things new just to make them new. That's not a part of my ethic at all. Again, with sustainability, I'm and my partly anti-capitalist stance, you know, it's like we don't just design to design and build to build, but it's about capturing a vision of who we want to be. And that to me is so exciting right now for Convergence to be able to say, who do we want to be in the next few years, that we've already started making these changes with the facilities, and to carry that vision out and to say, okay, now that we've shifted these buildings, we've downsized quite literally, right? What do we do with the space we have to maximize the impact and to have it show who we really are? And that to me is such an exciting opportunity that it takes me back to the beginning of Convergence, and it just makes me feel delighted about what's coming for all of us.
Well, great. Well, thank you again so much, Elise. You brilliant as always, and so helpful. And yeah, I just remember Karen's comment after Saturday. She's like, that was just downright fun. And I think that's a great.
It's my hope. You know, I don't think a Zoom recording is going to be as much fun as
we can tell you we had fun and we had cupcakes.
Yes.
And thank you very much, Rita, for giving us such lovely hospitality, even though you weren't able to be there.
It was wonderfully hospitable and welcoming. And I think that's just what we want to do more of.
So. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you. And if you have any questions, please email me, Elise, and we'll keep the conversation going. Yeah, thanks again, Elise.
I look forward to being part of this going forward. All right.
Bye. Bye, everybody.